Iowa State versus Houston, number 5 versus number 8, could be the game of the century, but ESPN seems to think this will be a Houston blowout. Why? Today on Locked On Cyclones.
You are Locked On Cyclones, your daily podcast on the Iowa State Cyclones, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into Locked On Cyclones, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Shout out to you for being here every single day and making this your first watch or listen of the day. I appreciate it more than you know. Wherever you're watching or listening, be sure to subscribe so we can prove once for all that is, in fact, a Cyclone state. Today we're talking men's basketball and their upcoming game against Houston for these first two. And then finally, in that third segment, we'll talk about the women and their win over Houston and the upcoming game against Baylor. Before we get that far, though, first things first, today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Ladies and gentlemen, I am not going to lie. This Houston-Iowa State game it's been a game I've circled for a long time on this upcoming schedule of Iowa State men's basketball games. It's going to be awesome. College game day will be down in Houston for this one. And if you missed the preview that Parker Ainsworth of Locked On Cougs and I did yesterday, you should go check that out because he obviously provides a little bit more Houston insight. And obviously his channel in general, great place to go for anything Houston Cougars related. But that being said, we're here to talk about the Cyclones. And for some reason, Iowa State is only given a 19.4% chance to win this game against Houston. Why? I do not know. Okay, Iowa State ranked number 8 in the AP rankings to Houston's number 5. So those are pretty similar, right? Well, the rankings, they're kind of subjective. They're kind of just whatever. Let's take a look at the records. Houston 22-4, Iowa State 21-5. Okay, those are pretty similar right there. That's basically one game difference. What about conference-wise? Okay, Houston 14-1 in conference, Iowa State 11-4. Maybe that's part of the problem. I actually went to KenPom just because I was curious if that was going to play a role. Maybe Iowa State slipped and I wasn't aware of this. That's not necessarily the case. Houston, number 3 in KenPom to Iowa State's 9. So really not, I mean, Houston given a little bit more in KenPom from, I think it was a 5-3, and Iowa State slips a spot. It is what it is. A lot of these these numbers in here, which are even a little bit above my head, they're pretty sophisticated. They're close though. I mean, they are pretty close. And so one thing that Parker pointed out during our little show yesterday, which was really quite helpful, and you really should go take a look, was the losses that Houston does have. Now, I have been critical of Houston, especially after their near win over UCF. At least in my mind, I know I haven't said it too much on the show because we're always talking about the next opponent, right? But I'm looking ahead to this Houston game all year long thinking, man, Houston, this one's going to be fun, man. Look at what the Big 12 championship game was last year. And look at where these teams are right now. Two of the best teams in the country. Obviously, you have Arizona and Texas Tech kind of in that conversation for Big 12 play. But Houston and Iowa State, to me, have felt like two of the best teams. Right now, we can expand on that conversation in a few minutes here. Don't worry. I know I'm probably upsetting a few people with that one. But taking a look at Houston's losses here, lose to a number 11 Auburn, second game of the season in a pretty close one, 5 points. Then they lose to a 9 Alabama, who has proved to be a very solid team, by 5 points. And then they lose to SDSU by 3 points, all within the first 2, 4, 6, 7 games. So they're 4-3 to start the year. And I believe every one of those games was before the end of November. Close losses, all right away at the beginning of the season. And then they go on an absolute tear before losing to Texas Tech 82-81. Now, there are some other, like the UCF 1-point win. Kansas, what happened there? So there's some signs along the way. But as far as the actual record goes for Houston, very strong showing, especially when you consider what Houston had last year. The loss of Shed was very much felt for this Houston team, who going into this game this weekend has 4 of the 5 starters from last year's Big 12 championship game. Okay, so still a very strong team, very veteran team, if you will. But the shed loss was felt early, and Houston was trying to figure out what can this team do, right? How are we going to go about getting wins, increasing the number in the win column? Essentially, that's really the most important thing. We harp on that all the time. Okay, but I will say I don't understand how this is the same thing to me as when we got to the end of college football season and it was like Boise State and Notre Dame and there was all these arguments of quality losses. What is that? And how much is a game from so long ago worth? And it's like, well, if you want to value uh, Boise State's close loss to Oregon, like that's a quality loss. They barely lost to the number one team in the nation, but it was in week 2. Well, what did Notre Dame do in like week 2? How'd that Northern Illinois game go? So if we're going to value, now this is all played out at this point, but that was my point of view at the time. If we're going to give Boise State so much credit for a quality loss, which I'm still hung up on, if we're going to give them that much credit for a loss that long ago, we got to have a conversation about Notre Dame. Now, Notre Dame, obviously, literally the second best team in the nation. Okay. Very good at football. Not saying that that's not the case. I'm just saying that there was an argument to be made there. And so where does that come into play here? It's tough. It's tough. All of this is just kind of random at times, it feels like. Now, those losses that Houston incurred, all close, 2 good opponents early in the year. I'm not saying that we shouldn't value those or just forget about them or anything like that. If anything, I'm leaning towards that's just what happens in basketball. Sometimes, especially early in the season, you're figuring out who you are. I have no gripe with that at all. Where I get gripe really is the fact that Iowa State is getting so much disrespect for the 7-game skid without Milan Momcilovic. That's really where my gripe lies. I have no problem with disregarding Houston's skid at the beginning of the year. But to me, then you've got to ignore basically West Virginia to Kansas. Okay. Obviously lost, then you win against UCF. And then, well, that was a crazy game. And then you start the Arizona trip with a win over ASU. And then the tough loss to Arizona I mentioned yesterday, just a deflating loss. Bang, bang, bang. And then Milan comes back. Now we're on a 4-game win streak. And this, of course, this game against Houston is going to be a great indicator of how good is this team, especially with Milan back at full, what is essentially full strength, as full as it's going to get. I don't appreciate what feels like blatant disrespect. And I'm not going to lie, I kind of like it's like the most controversial or contradictory statement I could have made right there. Because as I'm saying, like, man, we're just getting disrespected. It's like, okay, well, that's kind of where Iowa State thrives. That's where we've been for so long. That's how this team's going to go. But also, as a fan and as someone who's covering it, what are we doing? Just because Iowa State, because of the brand, I guess. I don't understand that. I don't love that either. But the thing with Houston, and I'm not trying to completely go after what they essentially did this season, because you want to go at the beginning part. Like I've already said, I'm going to let that go. But the win over UCF, like we're just going to ignore that. Okay, that's fine. I mean, you did almost double up Utah the next week, so that's impressive. Then you go to double overtime with Kansas. So, Kansas beat us, so I don't know how much really we can say about that, but are they that good? Then what about Texas Tech? Well, that's where I said we talk about it later. We talk about it right now. Texas Tech might actually be one of the best 3 teams in the conference. I don't think Arizona is on that same level as Texas Tech, Iowa State, and Houston right now. And maybe I'm wrong in that statement. So I'm going to let the Texas Tech one go. They're going to have to play in Lubbock after our game on Saturday. So that, like I said earlier, when we were talking about can Iowa State finish as regular season champ, going to have to get this win. Then obviously Texas Tech going to be a tough game. You got Kansas, you got Baylor in there. Houston has a rough end of the year. So I'm not gonna diss on the Texas Tech loss there, but it is still technically a loss and one that Iowa State did win. So all of that to say, No disrespect to the beginning of Houston's season, because to be completely honest, I I do think that's super long ago. I mean, it's just like feels like eternity ago. And it is the changes that Houston went through are massive. But you can't put that much value then in Iowa State's 7-game that stretch of the season, in my opinion. Now, obviously, I'm a little bit impartial or biased or whatever the heck the right word would be there. Either way, stick around. We'll talk about what Iowa State has to do to win this game because this is a must-win game. I mean, let's just call it how it is. Coming up right after this. When the game tips off, the NBA action is just getting started, and there's no better place to get in on it than with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. With FanDuel, you can place live bets throughout the game, so even if you miss the opening tip-off or want to bet on a fourth quarter comeback, you can stay in the action. If you're looking for a bigger payout, you can even combine your live bets into a same-game parlay. I love using FanDuel's live betting feature because it keeps every moment of the game exciting. Whether I'm backing my team for a late game rally or picking a player to hit a clutch three, I never feel like I missed my chance. Plus, the app is easy to use, and when you win, you get paid instantly. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. That's FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. Iowa State, Houston could be the showdown of the century coming up on Saturday. You're here with Locked On Cyclones, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And I mentioned it in the first segment. I'm going to mention it again. If you missed yesterday's episode, a breakdown with Parker Ainsworth of Locked On Cougs, go check it out. A lot of fun, and the dude knows ball, okay? Teaching and coaching. So you definitely should go take a look at that. But let's go a little bit more one-sided here. What can Iowa State do to beat Houston? Really, one of the best questions I thought that came of yesterday, and I thought about it a little bit more. Parker was wondering, what can Houston do to stop Iowa State? Now, two things here. One, that sounds like a question coming from a guy who's a little bit scared, but hey, it is what it is. Secondly, I like the way that he asks that because he's actually not sure. This team isn't held down to one singular identity. They're not a three-point shooting team. They're not necessarily one that's going to rely on one guy. Okay, and that more on that in a little bit. They're not only in transition. They're not only a team like last year's in which they have to hold the opponent to less than 60 points. This team can get it done in more ways than one, and we've talked about that over and over and over, and I understand that. But especially with Milan back, that's who they are. And really, what that question kind of boiled down to was who? Who? Because Curtis Jones leading scorer right now. Well, what happened, excuse me, in the Colorado game for Iowa State? Big win, 14-point win, and the most recent. And Curtis Jones had 7 points. So another point of evidence showing that we don't need Curtis to go for 30. We just don't. We don't really have a guy. So that's what I'm hopeful about. And what does this team need to do? Everybody's just got to play their game. I mean, I don't know if it's the Patriots fan of me thinking just do your job or what, but this team is so good across the board that Houston can't stop everything. They just can't. They only have the same number of guys that Iowa State does. Offensively, for the Clones, there is no way that Houston can completely shut it down. It'd be way too tall of a task. Now, that being said, what can Iowa State actually do? Well, Milan gonna shoot well, hopefully, and that'll be a big piece. Okay, if Milan comes out and shoots about his 40% or whatever, that's gonna help stretch the floor. Joshua Jefferson on the inside and everything he does, I can't even just say one thing, right? The way he goes about offense, his vision, his passing lanes, the way he sets things up, gonna be huge. What would I like to see here? I would actually love to see one thing in particular, which it doesn't really feel like it helps this team so much. It's just something I personally want to see. Keyshawn Gilbert with a few magical moves around the rim. Now, this can actually be a huge deal as far as momentum. in that capacity, but it feels like a little bit of a stretch. Overall, I just want to see that because it's awesome. I mean, how could you not, right? The bigger thing here for momentum is going to be hammers. We talked about it. I asked you guys what you thought. I'm still going to stick with the dagger if, under certain circumstances. But that hammer and the argument that TJ makes for this team responding to Brandon Chatfield scoring points in a position in which they don't necessarily rely on Brandon Chatfield to score. Obviously, those are essentially bonus points, as well as the momentum gained there. And what we've talked about in a little bit of that moral victory, like showing Houston, hey, we're dogs in here. We're going to come down with the rebound, and we're also going to get the putback. That's going to be huge. Now, if you want to talk about guys that aren't expected to scoring, Nate Heisey, if he can keep this momentum going from the Colorado game, maybe he only shoots 6 times. Maybe. That's completely fine. If he shoots 6 times, but makes 4 and one's a 3, that's more than enough. Are you kidding me? 2, 4, 6 plus 3, that's 9. You maybe get a free throw, it's 10. He's in double digits. That's a huge help. So I don't know what the numbers are going to look like, but I know Nate Heisey is going to get his playing time. Now, what does he do with that playing time? Is it defensive effort plays like Tamin, which we do need? Okay. If it's that, this team is won under those circumstances. But if we can get a few points out of Nate Heisey, I personally think that could be a huge stepping stone, I guess, towards a win for these Cyclones, because this isn't going to be an easy win. I mean, the way I'm talking about it, I'm convincing myself a little bit that these Cyclones are going to dominate, okay? But we talked about it and kind of conversed. This might be a single possession game with a minute to 30 seconds left, and it's a free throws that differentiate the game. Now, speaking on that, Iowa State has been great from the line. That doesn't worry me hardly at all. And I do think that the loss to Arizona potentially, I hope, taught this team some things. Maybe if Joshua Jefferson misses the second free throw, things turn out differently. I don't know. Maybe it was destiny. Okay. And that's just something that I don't have control over, unfortunately. Neither does TJ or Joshua Jefferson or Tamin Lipsey or any of them. As far as I know, none of them have control over destiny, if it's even a thing. So I can't tell you. But I can tell you, there was a lot of conversation about, does Joshua Jefferson miss that free throw? Because it's going to be tough to get a shot off after a bobble for the ball, right? I still agree with no timeout call. I do think that's, but if nothing else, that situation arising means the team, they sit down. All right, what are we going to, I'm not saying they didn't have this conversation before, but it pulls more attention towards it. Can't tell me that's not true. So hopefully we learn from that. Now, I will say, Houston getting Iowa State on Saturday, and then basically 48 hours later, getting to go up to Lubbock and face Texas Tech. Great opportunity for them in the tournament in that regard. Like, how are they prepped for that? Iowa State will have Houston on the 22nd, obviously on Saturday, and then on the 1st. So basically a week later, they will have Arizona. Now, there's maybe you could make an argument that that's kind of like between this, what would be like the Elite Eight and the Final Four. I don't love the argument, though. I do think Houston has a little bit of a leg up there. But anyways, let's round it out. I don't know why that popped in my head. Let's round out this whole Houston thing. I do think Iowa State comes away with this one. It's going to be a tough win. More than anything, it's a huge flag stick game for Iowa State, in my opinion. We're going to learn so much from this. And there's still 4 games left in the season, one of which Arizona at home, and I mentioned already, tough team. BYU coming up, and Kansas State to close out the year. Okay, this is it's enough away from the end of the year that Iowa State can still use this. It's not going to completely kill the momentum. I just need to see how this is going to go down. I cannot wait. I seriously cannot wait. I'm sure you can't either. Okay, this is going to be cinema, and we're going to learn a lot. And hopefully, I mean, let's put it out there. Milan scores 45 points. How sick would that be? That'd be like the coolest thing ever. That being said, we got to talk about the women's side of basketball, as yesterday was the crossover. We have yet to talk about their win over Houston. Excuse me. I don't know why I blanked there. Well, that's coming up right after this. Iowa State, Houston. Obviously, the men will be doing competing with Houston this weekend on Saturday. The women, however, already played Houston. The victory from Iowa State certainly turned heads, and then they'll face Baylor this weekend. We're talking about it here on Locked On Cyclones, by our Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day. Now, Iowa State and their win over Houston, relatively big deal, some are saying. 64-53 over the now 1-14 Houston Cougars. Iowa State, Iowa State 10-5 in the conference. Let's take a quick look at this. Then we'll talk about Baylor, and we'll talk obviously about the rest of the season because it's almost over. It is almost over. Iowa State had 4 players with double digits, and Sydney Harris with 9 coming off the bench. Nobody with a ton of points here. Nobody really standing out. Audie Crooks and Addie Brown both going for 12. Kelsey Jones with 13 and Emily Ryan with 11. Your assist leader in the game was Addie Brown with 6. Unbelievably, had 12 rebounds. So shout out to her for that. That is quite a few points, essentially 4 assists away from a triple-double, but a double-double nonetheless. This is just a solid win. This is one of those that I talked about. I don't think they'll have a ton of trouble with this one. And, to be completely candid, they didn't really. At the end of the first, it's a 4-point game, but it never was close after that. Iowa State held strong and got a bit of a momentum win, I suppose. They're still kind of just holding steady, still at that last 4 in position as that update. The prediction has not been updated. So obviously still need to close out with a few good wins here. Iowa State has 3 games remaining on the schedule for the women. You face Baylor this weekend, number 19 overall. Then you've got UCF on, I believe that is Monday. That's Tuesday, excuse me. Saturday, Tuesday, and then they'll play again on Sunday. So basically 3 games in a week, a little bit more. Baylor, UCF, K-State, and that'll be at home to close out the season. 2 big games here. Okay, and we'll talk about Baylor first, and then I'm going to talk about the rest of the season as a whole because we got a little bit of time here. Baylor Bears. Couple dogs, namely Little Page Bugs, and that is her full last name. It is Dariana Little Page Bugs. Leads the team in points and rebounds with 14.3 points and 10.5 rebounds per game. Jada Walker, your assist leader and steal leader for the Baylor Bears. Now, the Baylor Bears 23-5, first in the Big 12. This is certainly going to be a game that Iowa State could be tough. It could be tough. Iowa State Baylor with a few losses on the season. Most notably the Oklahoma State, I suppose, is in there. They did lose to number 1 overall UCLA and a TCU by 5. But other than that, big win over Houston, most recent opponent for Iowa State. Close with Texas Tech. They beat a West Virginia. I don't think I'm shattering anyone by saying that Baylor might be the better team in this. I don't think that's like unknown, I guess is what I'm trying to say here. Because obviously I'm going to root for Iowa State, don't get me wrong, but I don't think it's like I do think Baylor's a better team here. 82% chance to win this one. Iowa State obviously will be on the road. So this is a tall task. This is a very tall task. Now, I will say 4-game win streak for the Clones fares, in their favor here. Baylor, maybe there's a chance that they haven't been facing the best competition with Texas Tech being near the bottom. Colorado kind of around that Iowa State mark, but they did beat them by 22. So how do we approach this game? If Iowa State can win this one, this is a huge win in more ways than one, right? Many, many ways, this would be a monumental win. Obviously, the first being that it's a huge quality win. Okay. Tied for first in the Big 12 with TCU. And we saw them keep it close with TCU. We know this team's capable of it, and I'll get to that in a second. A huge quality win as far as tournament seeding and how likely are you to make the tournament going from that maybe last 4 in and boosting outside of that. I don't know exactly how the whole seeding thing works. Unfortunately, maybe I just need to sit down with someone who knows. But more than that, to me, that this is an indicator that Iowa State can be great. Bill Fennelly hasn't exactly talked about this team as world wreckers, but I still believe that they are a very solid team. I do think that they're about their record level, maybe a little bit better. We saw how they hung with K-State. I don't think they were necessarily close to beating TCU, but it felt like it could have happened. As someone who's rooting for them, I guess I don't know how a third party would have seen it. This is one they can get. They can. And it's going to be tough. But if they don't, that's where I'm going here is what happens in the rest of the season. You got UCF, a very, got to get that one. Very necessary. UCF also near the bottom of the Big 12. So very necessary to win that. Mandatory, actually, to win that game. Then K-State comes around. That's a winnable game. And I think if you lose to Baylor in a close game and beat Kansas State, I think you're still okay. Now, am I on the committee? Unfortunately not. Maybe I got to make a few calls. Maybe you got to make a few calls. We'll get me in there. Obviously, I know what I'm talking about. But with the nature of the close loss to Kansas State, and then if you're able to turn it around and essentially prove that it was a home versus an away environment type of deal, I do think Iowa State can still survive. And then obviously the Big 12 tournament being what it is. So there's a little bit of wiggle room here. I'm not saying that Baylor is a must win. Obviously, the last 4 were, and they were able to get it done in each of those. We've got a little bit of momentum under our belt. It feels like this team is firing on almost all cylinders. There are some few small things that I would touch up if I could. But I am not Bob Ross right now, and we just kind of got to take it where it is. This team is pretty good right now. I just want to see how they handle a bit of pretty serious adversity in Baylor. That TCU game, the score, I don't think reflects how close that was. It felt like Iowa State was in a position to make a shot. That's how I'm going to say that. And I want to know if they can handle Baylor. How does that game go is going to be a bigger dictator than the actual final score. Same thing with like the TCU game. But at some point you have to score more points than your opponent. At some point it's not about how did it go? It's like, did you win? So can Iowa State beat Baylor? I think so. I think they're good enough. It's going to take a bit of a Herculean effort. Wow, really worked my way through that word. Wow, that was fun. It's going to take a lot to beat Baylor, but it's one they can get. And if they get Baylor, look out. This team might just rip apart a Big 12 tournament and make a run in the bigger dance. Who knows? Who knows, man? This team, like I've said, got a lot of weapons. Got some weapons. Just got to use them. Got to show up. And I guess only time will tell. We'll see. Obviously, 2 huge games this weekend. Houston and the men, Baylor and the women. Going to be electric cinema. Obviously, the Twitter handle's down there. I'll be talking about it. Shout out to you for making it this point in the episode. If you haven't subscribed yet, what are you doing? We're proving it's a Cyclone. Stay here. Contribute to the cause. Until next time, Cyclone fans. Sayonara.